and welcome to Retro Encounter, episode 193. We are bringing a special topic today, mythology and folklore in RPGs. And with me, I have Mike Sollosi.
Hello.
And Lucy Gray.
Hi.
And I'm Hilary Andreff. I'll be kind of mining for now. So I thought it'd be fun to start by just asking a little bit about your mythology background and what made you in recording and mythology and RPG. So we'll start with you, Lucy.
Well, I originally started as a Latin major in college. Classical mythology specifically, and then wandered over into medieval history for my undergrad degree because I really wanted to make money as an adult, apparently. I've had always a fascination with mythology, spending 10 years in the museum world, doing a lot of research on various different works and the use of mythology in art. So I've got quite a bit.
Yeah, that's some rich experience. And I mean, mythology is something that's had a pervasive influence of culture over time. So I'm sure it's really interesting to see some of that from the museum lens.
Yes.
Awesome. How about you, Sollosi?
Right. Well, I'm almost another near classics major. I took about 12 or so credits in Greek and Roman history and Greek mythology, and thought about majoring in classics, but I was unwilling to learn Greek or Latin to do so. So I ended up majoring in geology and hydrology instead. I've had a lifelong fascination with mythology, dating back to a book of Greek myths that my parents would read to me, like a book of fairy tales as a child, and I still have a copy of that today, even though I've gone through 3 because they've become so worn over time. I mean, mythology and folklore is sort of so pervasive in so much of the fantasy stories and video games that I enjoy that it only sort of deepened my fascination with it, and I've continued to keep mythological texts and books of folklore around that I read enthusiastically. It's especially, growing up in the English-speaking world, mythology has such a huge influence on Western civilization and literature that you can't avoid it, really. And just the more I read, the more I like it.
Agreed. I have a similar experience. I kind of come at it from more of a literature sort of lens. That's what I studied in school. But I grew up reading a bunch of different myths and legends. And like you said, as I started seeing some of those stories being referenced in RPGs, it just made me want to know more. So I in turn read more. And there you have it. Okay, so moving from there, let's start talking about some of the precise ways that mythology has inspired RPGs. I mean, there are a lot of different games, a lot of different ways that mythology has made its way into these games. There are lots of many direct references, but also many indirect references. One of my first thoughts was Joseph Campbell, who wrote a lot about mythology, talking about the hero's journey. I mean, if you're thinking of it that way, many RPG protagonists are in that kind of journey of self-discovery and tick off a lot of the boxes there. But what are some of your thoughts on the categories?
Well, remarkably, we talked about the Campbell's hero's journey, I think 3 years ago on a podcast when we were, I think it was Josh, Chris, and I on the Child of Light episodes. But like the hero's journey is almost always, a person is chosen. They undergo hardship. They travel the world, and then they either achieve a goal or achieve an unexpected goal along the way. And that's I don't know I don't know the hero's journey boxes well enough to identify them all properly, but I think that because myths and legends are sort of our oldest stories, and even formative stories for like the belief systems of mostly ancient peoples, that they sort of influence all of storytelling going forward. And we don't really know what the first myths were. I think like the oldest. I think there's like a record of the Tale of Gilgamesh or something that's from like 3500 BC. But in these sort of the mythological frameworks, we see every kind of story, and RPGs because they're almost always stories about heroes or stories about rescuing or saving something. A lot of them will take direct influence from myths and legends, and also just like from a basic reference standpoint. I mean, the imagery and names of gods and monsters and locations from mythology are all over RPGs.
Well, and I mean, it's basic storytelling where you're dealing with a person in some ways starting a journey, um, and in that process growing and changing so that at the end, either their environment has changed so that their world has either become a better or worse place, or more importantly, they've changed in some way that allows them to be a better person by the end of the story. And that's sort of the basics of all human history of what stories have resonated and kept.
It's interesting because I think it really does go beyond the idea of just simply explaining things that aren't completely understood. Which, yeah, some stories do that, but there's definitely more of an overarching theme to it. So, yeah, basically RPGs, I mean, place names from mythology. One thing I notice a lot is enemies and creatures are frequently used across games.
Oh yeah.
You definitely have your harpy-like enemies, and
You quite often see Medusa-like characters, sea creatures based on myth, dragons and the like. So you get a lot of elements, even when the story isn't directly referencing a specific myth or story.
right. In this series, you have two important and long-standing RPG series that take a spin on it where they have entire collections of helpful mythological beings. They are sort of the overpowered surprise ace in the hole kind of thing that you can utilize in battles, and that's the summons in Final Fantasy and series. So it's not just enemies; they're helping out the party as well.
It's always interesting with particularly when so many people, like, some of their first experiences are games like Final Fantasy, and it will throw out all these names that you're vaguely aware of, even if you don't know mythology, like Odin or Shiva. And it's interesting that, particularly at least with Final Fantasy, you get a lot of these names evoking power, though sometimes they're completely disconnected from the actual myth that those names are involved in.
Yeah, Final Fantasy's Odin is not directly the Norse mythological Odin. He's sort of the Final Fantasy Odin has sort of made an old legend for himself. I don't think the Norse Odin has a sword called Zantetsuken. But I mean, Odin is a king wearing a helmet, and he does ride an 8-legged horse. So there are like imagery similarities between the mythological Odin and the Final Fantasy Odin. But they're like again, it's almost just the names and like the feeling of evoking power and familiarity with these names that I think that are more useful than directly borrowing these designs. Like they're not going to make Odin a one-eyed king with 2 ravens and 2 wolves and a giant spear necessarily. But enough people know what Odin is and are familiar with him that they did their own interpretation of Odin, but with sort of the clout that comes with the name Odin. If anything, the persona Odin is a little bit more similar to the mythological route than the Final Fantasy Odin is, because I mean, at least he has a spear.
Well, and that's the interesting thing about Persona. Persona has all these demons based on various mythology, particularly in Japanese and Indian mythology, and
and Norse. There's in some of the old SMT games, there was basically just factions of entire different mythologies. Like all of the Indian gods and goddesses were sort of one faction, and they'd be competing with a faction that was mostly Norse gods and goddesses. There's even a group of enemies or I should say, a faction of characters in old SMT games that are basically choirs of angels, and you fight 4 of them in a row in Persona 5 even.
Oh, that's right.
Yeah, they kind of like also vaguely group them into arcanas.
They do.
So that Yeah, so a lot of those like angelic personas are in Judgment, I think.
Well, I mean, every Persona demon is a character or demon from an older Shin Megami Tensei games, and the old SMT games will organize them in like the deity race and the demon race, and when they sort them into Arcana, it's it's less consistent. Like the angels are usually all judgment, but the Norse gods are almost always split between multiple arcanas
Hmm.
and are just one of the strongest of their particular arcana. So it's
Right.
not that consistent, like grouping to arcana. But I think the persona. The personae from Persona are supposed to be like mental representations of power that come from your soul, and because myths and legends are powerful, that's sometimes Persona manifests as creatures of myth and legend. It's kind of hard to say whether they're just SMT references or more specific mythological references. But Persona and SMT both really strive to adapt from myths and legends just as much as possible.
Yes, though nobody can quite explain why Mara is a giant dick.
I don't have an explanation for that.
Nope.
I mean, the first Mara I think was in Persona 1, and it was manifested from the lust of a sort of gross classmate of one of the main characters. But I mean, that's also Persona 1, and I want to talk about that game as little as possible.
A lot of those games almost invite Jungian archetype sort of view of the persona, especially 4.
Mm.
They're suggesting that you come into your persona once you beat your shadow, and you can improve them through social links or over time. So it's a slightly different spin than on Final Fantasy, where they're just supposed to be massively powerful external
Yeah,
beings who sometimes have their own village.
well, with Final Fantasy, they're implied that they come from the ether or come from another world, and you're summoning them to briefly augment your power. And for Persona, it is, as you said, like it comes from the Jungian concept of the shadow, and it's sort of the power comes from within. And by enriching your soul and empowering your soul, you can summon more powerful personae. But it's different almost with each Final Fantasy game. In Final Fantasy 14, I don't want to go too deep into Final Fantasy lore,
Oh yeah.
but a lot of these powerful gods and goddesses that are mostly from old Final Fantasy games, but sometimes from more general mythology, uh, basically you can summon these beings called primals if you have a lot of crystals to just to gather enough energy for them to manifest, and also faith. Like the more something is believed in or supported by the people, the more powerful it will be. And that already comes into the power of mythology. Like mythology and legends have lasting power because of belief. And so it's different game to game, but like Final Fantasy sometimes treats these mythological summons as otherworldly beings, and sometimes treats them as coming from the hearts of people worshiping them. And I think that almost makes it resonate more as mythological, even though I don't think King Moggle Mog comes from a human belief system.
Oh, it doesn't?
No. Although his inspirational story of like climbing a rope ladder between heaven and earth does sound very mythological.
It does.
Play Final Fantasy 14, people. It's great. And also in that game, instead of they don't make Odin a regular summon. Odin is basically a summoned sword that takes over the being of anyone that picks it up, which I thought is a cool interpretation of Final Fantasy or Odin. Almost as cool as one that transforms into a Japanese thunder god after you save him from being turned to stone.
Which thunder god? Sasano?
Raiden.
Right. Mhm.
Mm-hmm. Final Fantasy 6.
Oh, that's right.
Yeah. Odin turns into Raiden, and that's the only game where it happens.
An interesting subversion of Norse mythology with Japanese mythology.
Yeah, I was not expecting that at all. But I mean, we're floating around Norse mythology a lot. I think it might be almost the most appropriated mythology for Japanese RPGs. For some reason, Japanese people just love Vikings, because you see that stuff everywhere. There's the entire basis of the Tales series was like a world tree called Yggdrasil and ancient civilizations called Thor and Odin, and
Even the Mana series,
Yeah.
you're dealing once again with a giant life tree that is basically holding together the entire world, and tying back in Valkyrie Profile is very much tied into the Norse mythology.
Yeah, and Valkyrie Profile was created by Triace people that worked on the original Tales of Fantasia, so that group definitely loves Norse mythology. And I mean, Valkyrie Profile is very explicitly set in a Norse world. Same thing as Odin Sphere, which is not by the Valkyrie Profile people, but in both of those games, there's an Odin and there are Valkyries that go on some very unusual adventures.
Which is interesting because then when you look at American made RPGs, you start getting more and more in the Greek and Roman classical myths like God of War and things like that. So it sort of makes you wonder of, how different societies move towards different myths.
Yeah, well, I mean, I don't want to totally separate Western-made RPGs from Norse myth because a lot of it is inspired by sort of traditional Western fantasy, which one of the most prominent examples is Lord of the Rings, and Lord of the Rings is a almost naked adaptation of the Ring of the Nibelung story from Norse myth. So, yeah, there's a lot of Norse myth in Western fantasy and RPGs also, but maybe I don't know. I just keep seeing the pattern that Japanese RPGs borrow from Norse myth a lot when they have a less obvious connection than they would to say Japanese or Chinese folktales.
That's for sure.
But I mean, it's not strictly just Greek, Norse, and East Asian culture that like RPGs draw from myths. Like there's an unusual amount of Middle Eastern and pre-Judeo-Christian myth in these games. I mean, there's a text that's I think it's from Western Europe, but it's adapted from parts of the Kabbalah called Solomon's Key.
Yeah.
That is has sort of a lot of sort of foundational 16th, 17th century witchcraft stuff in it, and it also includes a list of 72 demons you can summon. And I think that probably more than half of those have shown up in SMT or Persona games over the years.
And even going back to Final Fantasy, you have Ifrit, which is a infernal djinn from Middle Eastern myth. So there's ties from all over the world in various RPGs.
And also Bahamut from maybe the most well-known Final Fantasy summon, I believe is sort of a world turtle from a pre-Islam Persian myth. It's like a turtle that swims around the world with the world on its back. I don't know the entire Bahamut story, but yeah, they borrow a lot of names from Middle Eastern folklore and myth as well. And also maybe Solomon's Key is most prominent in the very occult-themed Shadowheart series, where you have to collect names of demons from Solomon's Key and arrange them in an order following a story as a side quest in the game. Hilary, you've played Shadowheart's Covenant, right?
Oh yeah.
The Solomon's Key side quest is like my favorite side quest in that game that is unrelated to challenging wolves for dominance.
Yeah. It I don't even know how to describe it. Like, it's just incredibly fun. Just basically placing all these traditional demons in different areas based on which ones get along with other ones and where they want to live. It's really cool.
Yeah, well, the puzzle of it is like taking the little story vignettes about the demons that they give you and arranging them in a grid, basically. But
Right.
but the mythological origin of Solomon's Key is some, like early. It's an early occult text that's adapted from some myth and folklore, but probably was mostly just written by a bunch of exploitative Italians. Sorry, it's but
so much
still,
is
it's
written
cool.
by expletive Italians.
Oh yeah. Oh yes.
Europeans and
No, I'm as a lapsed Catholic, I'm 100% okay with blaming the Catholic Church for a lot of this.
Does that mean you also want to take a Bible and start whacking people over the head with it?
Oh yes, from the first game.
um,
Right.
I don't know.
Probably use that text as a weapon, Alice.
Quite literally.
I've only played Shadowheart's Covenant. I'm afraid.
No, but particularly the original Shadow Hearts, there's a lot of the biblical references in there, talking about ascension and using a lot of the folklore and legends from biblical times to sort of build out the story, even using the legend of turning lead into gold and Roger Bacon, which is a theme throughout most of the Shadow Hearts
Ooh,
series.
so did he learn how to turn lead into bacon? Because that sounds delicious.
Well, and the whole Emigrant manuscript, actually, that's a good point because that whole series revolves around this mysterious, ancient, mythological level text called the Emigre manuscript, and that has a bunch of forbidden knowledge, mostly probably about how to bring back the dead. And people, it's really, really powerfully appealing to people who want to bring back people they've lost, and that's gotten various characters into trouble throughout the series.
I mean,
So,
isn't that basically for every single Shadow Hearts game?
and
Let's
Kadelka.
bring back the dead. Nothing can go wrong now.
Yeah, Kadelka too.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a cool little theme in that series, is that how some of this knowledge actually can lead to misfortune.
Yeah, they do monkey's paw it a little bit. Like they really like hammer home the occult themes and also that the that great power has drawbacks and downsides,
Yep.
and they really take attack into Japanese folklore in this in the latter part of Shadow Hearts Covenant, where with the like I mean, shoot, there's isn't Susanoo or some other Japanese mythological figures the run of final bosses in the game, and it also touches back into the uh, reviving the dead and the Shadowheart series is just an absolute feast for people interested in mythology or the occult because it's a celebration of it and a sort of dark subversion of it that's really cool.
Yeah.
I mean, you literally have one of the characters going to the land of the dead to basically revive part of his past and reclaim his memories.
Mm-hmm.
Oh yeah, there's just sort of that metaphorical image of the graveyard too.
Mm-hmm.
Yuri's fusions fit into the category of sort of like helpful, powerful mythological beings, although the influences that there and some of them are more clear cut than others.
Yep.
Mm-hmm. So Lucy and I were talking about the influence of Norse mythology in Japanese RPGs, and we mentioned Valkyrie Profile a little bit, but maybe didn't go super deep into it. But Hilary, you and Rob Fenner, and I think also Steph Sabidlo were on a Valkyrie Profile podcast about a year and a half ago. I think like it was like early 2018.
Sounds right.
So, is that game more than just a celebration of Norse myth? Because I think they use the mythology in more than just a referential and sort of character name way.
They do. They do. It's kind of a second category of game that I really wanted to get into talking about, which is where they take a whole myth or a whole tradition and they build a new story or make it something slightly new from that. And I think Okami is another good example of that. I mean, it's very, very rooted in mythology, but we'll get to that. So yeah, Valkyrie Profile is steeped in Norse mythology because you play as a Valkyrie, traditionally a chooser of the slain who chooses fallen warriors to fight for Odin in Valhalla. So the game quite literally opens in Valhalla with this Valkyrie being awakened, and your whole task throughout the game is to recruit humans from Midgard, the human world, to fight mostly for you, but you do also transfer them up to Odin. That's one of the game mechanics. It's kind of cool.
Come to me, my noble Einherjar.
Yes. Um,
Okay.
so that's
And it's really cute because you get to then check in on the people that you've sent to Valhalla, and they've won this war, and they've made friends with this god, and
that's
it's
true.
very actually traditional North mythology where you have them fighting the battles of heaven
Yeah.
at, continually in the afterlife.
So it's interesting the way it's split, and it's a good example of melding the traditional with something new because you have a party of these fallen warriors that you keep with you at any given time, But the ones that you transfer are working with Odin, Thor, Freya, all of those other traditional Norse gods and goddesses to win their fight with the Vanir, who traditionally are really not so much antagonists, but an older group of gods that sent over Freya and her brother as sort of a token of goodwill.
And Njord as well.
Yeah,
They're usually not like you said, they're usually not evil. Just sort of other. And but shoot, there was one Vanir witch that started the Aesir Vanir clash that ended up in a hostage exchange, basically.
right.
But I don't remember her name. But yeah, they make the Vanir sort of more blanketly evil in Valkyrie Profile than I think the mythological texts do.
They do, and they kind of conflate some of them with some of the giants who are around in Norse mythology, like Surt. I think in the B is the main villain in the B ending of Valkyrie Profile, and he's definitely affiliated with the giants traditionally. So they kind of take some liberties, but in doing that, I mean, it fits better into the whole flow of the game and kind of becomes its own thing. And another interesting thing about that is you can actually boost your warrior's personality traits as well before you send them to Valhalla. So that's
Okay, so you're sure that Valkyrie Profile isn't actually a dating sim? Because I'm getting some mixed messages here.
yes, I'm sure it's not.
All right.
There's very little dating happening in Valhalla.
Says you. When were you last in Valhalla?
It's true. Fair. You do actually also visit some of the other worlds from Norse mythology as well. Alfheim, where the elves hang out, you go there. It's your main chapter 7 quest. I think the light elves have an artifact that the Aesir and Odin want for a battle, so you have to kind of trick them and get it.
I mean, Valkyrie Profile is interesting in that way because Japan is, for some reason, right next to England.
Oh yes, they.
Oh, they're both islands. Islands are close together, right? That's how geography works.
That's true. That's worth mentioning. They kind of melded a little bit of Eastern culture in there too, because in Midgard, most of it is very, very kind of traditional European inspired. But you have one island called Hailan that is very, very much like Japan. Another really interesting sort of subversive thing they do with it is, especially in the second game, which I won't go too much into that, but there are hints that Odin started as an elf, which is kind of interesting, and obtained the power of creation. And because he was a half elf, he could like grow and change. So that's how he got to be the most powerful god. And that actually kind of spoilers for the ending of Valkyrie Profile, but that's sort of what ends up happening. If you get the A ending of Valkyrie Profile, is Lenneth, the Valkyrie, remembers about her human past, which makes her a more caring, compassionate being, and she ends up somehow that gives her the strength and the ability to obtain the power of creation. So she ends up saving the entire world through that power from Loki. So that's another thing about it. Loki, he's kind of a hidden bad guy, quote, but he's very much the bad guy in Valkyrie Profile.
Loki's an interesting character in mythology, though. He does not start out bad. He starts out as like the smartest and coolest frost giant, who is so impressive to Odin that they become blood brothers very quickly. And there's a lot of myths where Loki goes on adventures with Odin or Thor, basically as a supporting good guy character.
Oh yeah,
But it's not really until the sort of death of Balder story and the Ragnarok story where he becomes more outwardly evil, even though
right.
he's the technically the father of 3 of the most horrible monsters in the entire Norse universe. He's
Right.
an interesting character, but he's also, I mean, what you might call a trickster god, like a god that is sort of anti-establishment engages in trickery to either serve their own ends or the people's ends or the gods' ends, and and I mean, and I'm only bringing up the trickster guard archetype at all because in Persona 5, every character in that game, their starting persona is a famous thief or rebel from folklore or history, and they evolve into, or actually, I said evolve like they're Pokemon, but after you complete their social link, they transform into a trickster god of sorts. Now, exactly what they call a trickster god is kind of vague. It's up to interpretation. Whether the choices they made are really rebels or really tricksters. But I don't know. Maybe I sort of wish they'd gotten a little weirder, like one of them was a Nancy or something.
And I would have loved to see a Nancy. That would have worked so well.
Right? That was my dream, but nah, alas no. We got Milady instead.
Well, it's sort of really interesting that we got this trickster element, though it's not really openly discussed in the games, whereas in Persona 4, you're dealing with the battle of Izanami versus Izanagi, one of the most major mythologies of Japanese origin, and
it's almost it's maybe the most important creation myth of traditional Japanese folklore, and all of the characters have Japanese gods and heroes as their personae.
Shout out to Tomoe, because she has a Naginata, and I do Naginata, so that was always made me really happy.
And shout out to Kamui, Teddy's persona, which is also a name of a region in Okami, which is a traditional god of the Ainu people of Japan, which I think is also underrepresented.
Yeah, that's awesome. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I really wish they had pushed the rebellion agenda and gotten a little bit more deeply into that at multiple points during Persona 5, because I always wanted more of a feeling of it, of open rebellion and like it affecting the world more. I don't know.
Yeah, I really like the anti-establishment message of Persona 5 and the idea of of stealing the sins out of people to better themselves was kind of brilliant. There's a lot of really cool conceptual stuff in Persona 5, but I wish that they I like the tone of the story a lot too, mostly, but I sort of wish they had gone a little bit harder into the trickster nature.
It's interesting because it's in many ways Persona 5 is the least mythology driven game, because when you go back to Persona 3, you're dealing with the concepts of death, and you're dealing with the characters literally going to Tartarus every night.
Yeah, they go into death a lot, but also death as change and not death as the end. And the journey of the soul, and they use the metaphor of the tarot cards more strongly in that than in Persona 4 or 5. But also, I mean, the main character's ultimate persona is called Messiah, for Christ's sakes.
Yeah. Yep.
But yeah, Persona 3 also uses more Greek mythological elements than Persona 4 or 5. Amusingly, in Shin Megami Tensei, the monster Cerberus is a minor character in a lot of the games, but he started out in one of the early games as just a recolor of the Nue monster. So Cerberus in old SMT is a white lion with a snake tail, and not the not the three-headed dog that we are used to Cerberus being. But in Persona 3, you have the real MVP of the story, Koromaru, a dog, summon his own version of Cerberus, which is a three-headed Doberman with fire and darkness powers, and that's my Cerberus. Yeah, that's what's up.
I think that's hands down the best depiction of Cerberus in a video game.
Yep. And it's
I like the Cerberus boss fight in FF14, but it's based on the FF3 Cerberus design, which is not as cool as Koromaru's.
Yeah, it's also interesting to mention though that Koromaru himself is based on some a kind of story that's grown to be a little bit of modern Japanese folklore.
Yeah, the what is it? The Hachiko.
Yep, Hachiko waiting for his owner.
Mm-hmm, yep.
Day after day.
That's not a myth or a legend. That's something that actually happened.
Yeah. Well, no, I know, but the story's kind of grown. You know what I mean?
Oh yeah.
And that one's actually an interesting story because it has actually happened in different cultures. Like there's a similar story in England, and there's similar stories in America too. where you have statues of dogs specifically honoring these dogs that waited for their master patiently. So it's almost like one of those universal myths that and legend, since it's based in fact, that's sprung up across the modern world.
So we're saying that Hachiko and Balto and these stories of loyal dogs are the 20th century version of like the myth of the flood. that was a comparison you were probably not expecting to hear today. Yeah, Utnapishtim, Deucalion, Noah, they're just dogs.
Oh Jesus! Oh,
Think of how events inspire stories and how everything can grow.
Yeah, and that there are similarities across mythologies that did not have an obvious origin. Let's see, Hachiman from Indian folklore is probably has the same origin as Son Goku or the Monkey King from Chinese folklore. Those are two very similar monkeys from nearby regions that probably have a shared origin somewhere. But I don't think you can make that same case for Utnapishtim versus Noah versus Deucalion. That kind of story is shared between mythologies and repeats itself, even though they probably did not, originate from exactly the same place. And that just goes to show how different peoples and different storytellers and belief systems will always sort of go back to some of the same ideas because they're among the most universal and powerful ideas.
yeah, and going back to dogs, I mean, you talk about the game Okami, where you're having
an excellent dog game.
Yes. An excellent, the good dog, where you have so many elements of Japanese mythology. Though I'm not sure the goddess Amaterasu, how she would feel about being depicted as a dog.
I think Amaterasu is one of those goddesses that sort of has multiple forms. Like sometimes it'll be a woman, sometimes it's a representation of the sun. But I don't know specifically of her being a dog. I'd have to check some sources on that. But
yeah, I can't think of any stories where she's explicitly in a form like that.
Yeah.
But
It's not like Hathor, who is sometimes a bull, sometimes a lioness, sometimes a pregnant woman, sometimes 9 separate women. Like the different aspects of mythology is something that's you have to sort of just accept when you start reading these stories. But
so it's really interesting that her main weapon of the game is a mirror, when that is one of the core popular stories of Amaterasu, of having the mirror to draw her out of the cave and
where she's hiding.
Yeah, and it's also a subversion of the damn it. I think it's the Susanoo Orochi story where the 3 sort of sacred items that he uses are a mirror, a sword, and a chain.
Yep.
And those are her 3 weapons.
3 weapons. Yep.
And also weirdly are the Kusanagi, Yatagarasu, and I had to forget the name of the third one. Are also 3 characters in King of Fighters, which is so there's a really weird use of Japanese folklore that does not make any sense in the Orochi storyline from the mid '90s King of Fighters fighting games. But Japanese folklore shows up in all kinds of strange ways, and maybe like sometimes a more obvious way, like the entire game of Okami or the personas in Persona 4, and sometimes you'll just collect those the mirror, beads, and sword in a bunch of different RPGs. I know you do that in Tales of Symphonia, for one. They're items that you get for beating 3 monsters called sword dancers. But yeah, maybe it's unsurprising. A lot of Japanese folklore shows up in Japanese RPGs.
In terms of items, I mean, they also borrow items from various traditions as well.
Oh yeah. How many times do you collect a sword called Ragnarok in Japanese RPGs?
Or Excalibur. That's a whole other set of stories that we haven't really touched on.
I mean, the fact that so many modern RPGs have some version of Phoenix Down.
Yep.
Yeah, in fact that there are firebirds or phoenixes across so many different mythologies.
Yep.
And Going back a minute, I don't know. I think Okami's fine. If we have Loki who can literally shapeshift, and we have other deities,
I don't think it's disrespectful to Amaterasu to have a game portray her as a very, very good dog, but with good yawning animations. I always appreciated
oh
those.
my gosh.
Ami's idle animations are really good in Okami.
Yes, yes, they are.
Well, and I love the fact that they took her brother Susanoo, and who's known in mythology as being this boorish, unkempt, terrible character who at one
Oh, yeah.
point
Cooks in the rice fields, if I'm not mistaken.
cooks and rice fields and on her throne.
Ew.
And make him the, slovenly, unkempt swordsman who ends up, having to be goaded into saving the world.
By her.
Yes.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
Okami has a really sort of sly sense of humor
It does.
about it. Yeah, they take a playful tack with a lot of these interpretations of Japanese folk tales, and just because of how much of a goofball and reluctant hero Susanoo is when he's always portrayed as sort of brusque, but also strong. At least in the other myths, it's and I don't know. And this is a game about a very good dog and a very bad fox at one point. And taking the QB nine-tailed fox story into into a very, very interesting twist. In fact, that middle third of the game is probably my favorite part of the game.
Yeah.
But it's Okami is a really cool celebration of Japanese myth, and that reminds me. Have you guys heard of a series called Far East of Eden?
By name, I don't know much about it.
It's okay. Now here's the part where I wish that Robert Fenner was on this podcast.
Yep.
Yeah, but it's a series of games for the old PC 90 engine series. I think the first two were on the PC engine, and then it had one on the SNES and one on the Saturn and PS1, I think. But it was a very popular series of Japanese RPGs that never left Japan and are explicitly a fantastical interpretation of the Jiraiya story, with Jiraiya the boy who rides a frog, and Tsunade the girl who heals with slugs.
Jiraiya, also a persona.
Yeah, that's true.
Pointing out.
I think Orochimaru and Tsunade might be also, but but it's basically just a very, very Japanese folktale influenced RPG series that was very popular in Japan in the 90s and then just sort of died out. And I know that you can get a full translation, fan translation, of course, of the SNES one, but I'm not sure about the others. That series has always been sort of near the top of my Japan only, wish I could play it kind of video games.
So do you have an idea if they take a similarly kind of playful take on their story? Or?
Yes, it looks that way. There's definitely a lot of humor and a lot of anime goofiness in that series, but it was one of the first RPGs to use animated cutscenes and sort of like cutaways to big 90s style art. Even though I think the first game was 88 or 89, but I sort of think of it as a 90s series. It's again, when we were talking about doing an episode based on mythology, I'm like, oh man, maybe I can talk about Far East of Eden, but it sort of starts with the Jiraiya myth, and then it looks like it completely goes off the rails after a few characters are introduced, and it's at least 4 games. I'd have to check a list.
Going back to Valkyrie Profile for a minute, because I'm seeing a little bit of a contrast here, so I hope you don't mind.
Oh, please.
But it's really interesting to compare those games that we just mentioned with Valkyrie Profile, because they use the mythological frame for a very different effect there. Like I would say that Lenneth, the Valkyrie's traditional mythological job as someone who takes the souls of dead warriors and trains them to be among the Aesir, that kind of invokes some instant drama when you meet characters in Valkyrie Profile, because you know that they're all going to die and you basically watch it. So they kind of use their mythological frame to create some drama and a little bit of sadness.
Yeah, there's a lot of tragedy in the Ragnarok story of Norse myth, because I think the entire pantheon dies except for 8 to 10 people or so.
Yeah, very, very few are left. So, and that's actually mentioning Ragnarok specifically is important because part of the whole premise of Valkyrie Profile is it's basically a countdown to Ragnarok as
Right.
well.
You have to win the game in a certain number of turns because at the last turn, that's Ragnarok.
Yeah. And it's very dramatically at the beginning of each chapter, it'll be like X number of chapters left until the end of the world. We're like, okay, thank you, game.
Now you get to go watch some more people die.
I think that's a game I would definitely want to play with a guide because that kind of stakes and that kind of and I know the rigidness of the different endings would just give me it would fill me with so much terror that I could be doing something wrong while playing.
Well, that's also one of those games that the guide itself actually dives a little more into the myths that are involved in the game. So it's a really interesting accessory piece to the game and helping to understand what it's drawing from on Norse mythology, and even the specific areas that it goes to in the game often have some tie back into the Norse mythology.
That's interesting, and I mean, I enjoy the idea of Valkyrie Profile for all of its gameplay innovations and for its interpretation of Norse myth. I do want to play it, but again, like just being busy with other things and being slightly intimidated by all of the stuff surrounding it is what's preventing me. But come
on! You only have 35 games on your list right now?
Oh boy, and like 5 of them I'm supposed to play for the podcast this week. But the I was thinking about Far East of Eden, another 90s series that's a very naked interpretation of myth that I'm surprised we haven't mentioned yet, is the Glory of Heracles games. I think only one of them came out in the West, and it was a DS game that was like a remake of Heracles 4 or something. I don't know much about the series, but there was for many years, dating from the NES, I think, a series of Japanese RPGs explicitly based on the Greek myth of Heracles or Hercules. But I don't think there were elemental fairies in Greek myth, or but there's definitely a lot of tunics and buildings with columns.
I mean, they're kind of they're the nymphs.
There are nymphs.
For different settings.
And there is a concept of multiple elements and humors that was in Greek culture and Greek myths, but I don't think there was specifically, fire nymphs giving you fire sword powers, like in the DS game. But that's at least one JRPG that takes advantage of myths in a very explicit way.
Yeah, and another cute little old game that does something similar is God of Thunder, which I played on DOS forever ago. And they're loosely based on a lot of the big Loki's children, really. The one I played was the one with the world serpent.
I don't remember which one I played, but one of my neighbors did have a DOS God of Thunder game. I remember just when you threw the hammer, it sort of went across the whole screen until it hit something and returned to you.
Oh yeah, and you can make it hover, like if you moved and it couldn't get back to you.
Yeah, And the puzzle rooms were like I don't know, they were very segmented, like in houses or buildings, but were sometimes sort of overwhelmingly just like covered in spikes or something. It was I remember or at least a God of Thunder DOS game, but I'm not very aware of the series.
Yeah, they're like loosely based on some events from Norse mythology, but it is very much like kind of an action, almost platformer, puzzle solving kind of thing. And
I thought it was weird Zelda with a boomerang hammer, basically.
Yep, basically. I mean, there's a village, at least in the one I played, where you can kind of do little Zelda-like quests that are limited to, like, finding an item to clear the way to some area.
Anyway, maybe I misheard you. Are there multiples of these, or was this just one game?
I think there were 3.
Okay, yeah, I have no idea which one I played, but I definitely played one of them.
And it was yet another example of, I think they set Loki up as an antagonist. But it's cute because Odin is like your tutorial. If you try and hit anyone in the village with a hammer, he will show up in a text box and say, "Son, I know it's fun to mess with mortals, but it will lower your score in this platforming game." And and
Okay,
the other
Hilary, you'll be thrilled to know that the first God of Thunder is available on Steam for free because because the game was originally shareware and is now in the public domain.
yes, yay! I love those. Um, but yeah, and another interesting thing about it is you can get trapped very easily by those puzzles that are in random buildings or
Yes.
sometimes out in the environment. And one game mechanic, because you're Thor, you can choose to die to send yourself back to the beginning of the screen to redo the puzzles.
This is the best interpretation of the Thor myth. We can get out of here, Marvel Comics. Get out of here, every other video game. This is the true Thor.
He's busting his way through puzzles and messing with mortals until Odin tells him not to.
I was not expecting to talk about the Thor DOS game that I remember from 20 years ago in this podcast.
There you go.
One of my neighbors had it, and I thought it was the strangest game I'd ever seen. I very vividly remember playing one of them. I didn't even know there was more than one.
Really, really odd little cute thing, but worth mentioning. All right, so to wrap up, does anybody have a favorite myth or favorite resources for learning about mythology that you want to share?
Books.
Do you remember what myth book that you had as a kid? I'm curious.
Oh yeah, no, I still have it. It was called Dolaire's Book of Greek Myths, and it had a lot of it had a lot of very beautiful illustrations, and very stylized ones. And they also had a book of Norse myths that was also very good, but maybe not quite as memorable as the Greek one. But I've gone through so many copies of that. I think I'm on my third hardcover of that because invariably especially when I was a kid, I would read them so much that the spine snapped and everything. So
well, I purposely snapped my spine now being a school teacher because then I could use the cards. We took the pages and we laminated them in cards to read to the kids. But
my favorite picture from that whole book is the Pantheon family tree. With the big weird dead-eyed Zeus in the center, because that's how I remember who's related to what in Greek myth. I think of that vaguely creepy Zeus family tree from Dolaire's Book of Greek Myths. but yeah, it's an excellent book and great for adults or children just because it's so big and cool and covers a lot of the bases. Like I remember it doesn't have every single Greek myth in it, of course, because it's aimed at children, so. You won't find the Ovid's Metamorphoses version of Pyramus and Thisbe in there, but it covers a lot of ground.
Yeah, agreed.
But if you want a more traditional Greek myth resource, I mean, like Bullfinches or Hamiltons are the textbooks I see floating around the most. Yeah.
All right. Well, I will add one. So there's a YouTube channel called Crash Course that partnered with the guy that used to do segments for PBS Idea channels, and they have a Crash Course Mythology, which is a lot of fun. If you're interested in how myths tie together and kind of common themes, that's a cool YouTube series.
And I should actually mention the thing that I forgot to mention when we started this podcast is that actually Edith Hamilton was the founder of my high school.
Oh,
cool.
Okay.
Which is part of the reason why I got to do every single possible thing I could do with mythology, including in third grade building a 5-foot Athena sculpture.
Were you even 5 feet tall in third grade?
No. It was larger than I was, and it was great. It was modeled after the Athena Parthenos from Athens. And it sat in my basement for 3 months until it finally dissolved into icky bits. But there's one book that I would highly recommend for everybody is Zeus Grants Stupid Wishes.
Oh, Lord.
This book has been thrown around our group of friends since the wee times. It's absolutely hilarious takes on Greek mythology, on going into a lot of the backstories on each of the myths, sort of being told almost as if Deadpool was reading the Greek and Roman gifts.
That's a good description. Very modern kind of language, lots of profanity. It covers a lot of ground, though. I mean, it's got sections for most of the major areas of the world and mythological traditions.
It is a beautiful, beautiful book, and it's a
I
great.
hope it has a lot of jokes about Zeus being a terrible deadbeat dad.
Oh,
I
yeah.
do. I think it does, but it's
Good.
it's one of those books that for a lot of people who had to suffer through really dry classical mythology classes is a great way of getting back into the fun of mythology.
How is Aeschylus's Prometheus different from Hesiod's Prometheus? And how did the Hesiod's theogony influence the tone of Aeschylus's the Prometheus bound? Yeah, I know what you mean.
That's actually, sadly, that's better than my last college course on classic mythology, where my professor talked for 3 hours straight on the various mushrooms he had tried while supposed to be talking about Greek mythology.
Oh, wow.
Wow, I can't even think of a single mushroom in Greek mythology. So maybe I just haven't read enough colorful interpretations of Pandora's box's monsters.
Apparently, he wrote an entire paper on how Greek myths were all written because the Greeks were high all the time.
Well, you would say that the Greeks were drunk all the time because they did have a god of wine, but also Greek wine would have been watered down compared to modern wine. So I don't know, hard to say. Maybe the Greeks were just a bunch of lightweights.
Well, and also they were all lead poisoned too.
That is true. I have one question for each of you. Is there a specific portrayal of myth in video games you haven't mentioned yet that's like just one of your favorites that you want to shout out before we close down the episode? Like, I'll go first because I can't believe you haven't mentioned this yet. In probably my favorite Atlas game, not named Persona, Digital Devil Saga. It's set in a weird, possibly post-apocalyptic wasteland where the place names are based on chakras, and people turn into monsters named after various monsters from various mythologies, but mostly devas and asuras from Hindu and proto-Hindu myth.
Oh.
So it's a completely insane game. It also has a Cerberus in it randomly. It's one of the few non-Hindu names in it, but it's like it uses the sort of the concept of the soul and karma and dharma in metaphor for traveling through this world, and has a really weird, like, sort of not really cyberpunk, more like grim punk interpretation, storyline interpretation. But you do turn into asuras from mythology and try to eat other people turning into asuras. So it's brutal and weird, but also one of the coolest PS2 RPGs, and it's very, very rooted in some Hindu and some Buddhist names and iconography.
Wow. Yeah, you describing it that way kind of makes me imagine some of those giant battles from like the Mahabharata or the Ramayana.
Not really. It's more like, oh shoot, it's like people with guns over a wasteland turning into monsters and then trying to eat the other people they're fighting. It's
grimmer.
It's real strange, but it's again one of the coolest PS2 RPGs. I tried to replay it for the podcast like around 2 years ago and ultimately failed because because it's a challenging long game and I wasn't able to finish it in time. So I even like apologized to the listeners in part 2 of that podcast. But it's a very, very cool PS2 RPG that incorporates that mythology extremely well, and I'm a little embarrassed I didn't bring it up earlier. So either of you want to do a final shout out before we close it out?
I think I'll just talk a little bit. Something I was thinking of saying earlier too was actually about Shiva, because that's it's interesting what's happened to Shiva in Final Fantasy, because traditionally Shiva is associated with destruction, not necessarily completely negative, but just like things ending. But traditionally Shiva is also multifaceted, and I learned that one of those facets of Shiva is actually female and associated with water. So it's kind of interested how that's become conflated with possibly another thing from Japanese myth, which is the Yuki Onna, the snow maidens, as well. So I think I just want to point out Shiva as sort of like a melding of various imagery from myth.
Though I will say I'm always disappointed that they don't have Shiva as a dance master.
Very, very good point.
Um,
Traditionally a dance master.
but also, for my game, we did touch upon Shadow Hearts and such, but the original Shadow Hearts, not the Covenant, of the various biblical and little sort of fun tie-ins of really, really archaic roots of Christianity has always been a fascination for me. And the original game of the series, Kadelka, tying into all those really sort of darker myths that people forget about when they talk about biblical stories.
All right. So in terms of housekeeping, next up on Retro, we're going to have a game journal on Until Dawn. So look out for that. And then on the schedule after that, we are going to be playing Trials of Mana, which is very, very exciting. I know for many of us, long anticipated game. Woohoo! Woo! And also around that time, we're going to have a very negative episode.
That episode is still in the planning stages, but it's going to be a lot of fun to record. I'm looking forward to talking to people about that.
Yeah, it sounds interesting from what I've heard so far.
We're too positive on this. We're too positive on this podcast. We just need to just let the hate out for a full episode.
You mean besides the quiz shows?
Yes. Oh! You heard me on the you heard me wish for everyone's failure on the quiz shows. You mean?
Yes.
I'm thrilled at how much I saw them struggle. That was a blast. Oh, and permit me to cut in for a minute, Hilary. Speaking of quiz shows, we've done some experimentation on Retro Encounter the past few months. We had an episode all about a specific villain. We had that quiz show episode. We had a movie episode, and we had a revisited episode where we re-examined an old subject of the podcast from a few years ago. And so, listeners, if you have suggestions for a new episode in one of those formats, like a new villain episode or a new quiz show all about a certain subject, or another old Retro Encounter game you want to see revisited, please let me know, because I thought all those episodes were fun, and I think we can bring back those formats again. So please reach out, because I don't know what people want unless they tell me.
Sollosi, yeah, where can they reach you by?
They can email the podcast. retro@rpgfan.com is the best way.
And that feedback will help us know how to proceed with some of these really neat new formats. So please share the feedback. And you can also comment on our old forums, visit us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Discord. We're streaming quite often on Twitch, so visit us there as well. And be sure to take a look at Random Encounter. That's our podcast more focused on what people are currently playing in current events. And we're also working on hopefully getting Rhythm Encounter going as well, to focus on music. And remember to review us on iTunes, Google Play, or your chosen podcast listening venue. And let's also mention where we can be contacted individually. I'm EP Fire on Discord, and that's the best way to reach me. How about you, Lucy?
I'm Jess Idris, JESIDRES, on Twitter, Tumblr, and various other platforms.
Great. And how about you, Sollosi?
I am at The Real Monsoon on Twitter most of the time. I'm also Monsoon Mike on Discord and Monsoon on the RPG Fan forums.
Great. Well, we hope everyone's enjoyed this preliminary discussion of mythology. There's a lot to unpack here, and a lot more that we could have covered and may talk about again with individual games or not. So yeah, let us know your favorite mythological representations in RPGs, and we'll see you next time.